So it's Mr. Dragonbeard here. Thought I'd go through a little bit of a thought check process for people who are complaining right now about a number of things. In particular, right now in Ontario, Conservatives have won the election after much warning by myself and many others to the Liberals, the Leftwingers, that they were running roughshod over people. The left is clearly the most obvious and undeniable threat to personal liberties and freedoms. They like to talk about democracy, but as soon as it doesn't go their way, as you'll see in this case, they immediately start looking for ways to use tricky phrases and loopholes to attack democratic outcomes and praise anyone, including what I'll go into here, activist judges, which are an increasing problem currently, who feel it's their job to overturn the will of the legislatures, which is to say the will of the voters in any place that has free elections. So let's jump into this, shall we? All right, so this here is just a quick overview in Canada, constitutional distribution of legislative powers, because the number one thing that's happened here, the argument is Doug Ford won. He's a conservative. His brother was the very popular crack-smoking mayor, Rob Ford, who became even more popular after all of the scandals broke out, which they've never been able to come to terms with. I don't approve of smoking crack. I think that should be grounds for removal from office. However, the reason for his popularity should be something that liberals or left-wingers need to examine this. Why was he more popular than ever before? These guys, the Fords, and the people that surround them want to bring back the voice of people, everyday person, and they want to cut down on spending by elites and the abuse of power. This is long overdue, and it's very much akin to what's going on with Trump in the United States. And rather than trying to learn what's going on and understand it, lefties are just getting angry, of course. So powers of the Parliament of Canada. So these are federal, under the Constitution, these are the powers to the federal government to enact laws and carry authority. So we got sections 91, 92, subsection 10 of the Constitution Acts 1867, which is our first constitutional confederation, to 1982. So now the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was added much later. I believe this is in 1982 that it was added. Anyways, this is the federal. So the federal has all these: unemployment insurance, postal service, national defense, seacoast, currency, banking. So all of the stuff, citizenship. Now, the province, for anyone who's not clear on this, is essentially in many ways like a state. And they have collective bargaining powers and individual powers within their own territories. And the federal government is not to usurp them. And the Constitution lays these powers out. So what do we see in here? Municipalities fall under the constitutional power. Here are the sections for you. Subsection 92 and 92A and 93 of the Constitution Acts, right? Concern matters of a local nature. This is why the judge's ruling to overturn an act of the legislature to reduce the number of seats in Toronto for the city council members before an election, not during, but before an election, is counter-constitutional. It goes against all precedent law in this country. It is a violation of the Constitution itself. So from here, we're going to see we have precedent. This was back in the late 90s. Mike Harris, another conservative premier, amalgamated many different cities that we used to call the Greater Toronto Area. He amalgamated them all into one city council. They called it the Mega City of Toronto. That was the cute name for it. And it was found in court that he had, as the premier, like the Ontario legislature, had the right under the Constitution to control that. That is their purview. And again, this goes against the ruling we just saw. And yet every left-winger I know keeps screaming that this is anti-democratic, that it's attacking the will of the people of Toronto. It's funny because we have an election that we just went through a few months ago. The orange is a group called the NDP. They are not very important. The blue are the Conservatives, and these are the small areas because they are higher in population. So this is what Ontario essentially looks like. We've got the United States down here, Quebec over here, and then the prairies up to the left, the Arctic up north. So let's zoom in. So up here in the urban areas, we've got a Liberal and a bunch of NDP. And they have their own reasons for voting that way. We have a few, way over here, few Liberals. By the way, the Liberal Party was so corrupt over the last decade that they lost official party status. They're not an official party anymore. These are all conservative ridings under Doug Ford. Okay? And his promises included things like reducing the expenses of City Hall in Toronto. And everyone in Toronto knew this. Let's zoom in on Toronto. Do. All right. So here we have the area that was megacity, essentially. This whole area is affected by Toronto politics, and these are the inner areas. So we do have NDP. That's one of the outlying areas. We have 3 seats that went Liberal. But look at this. Oh, what's this? Scarborough again. Don Valley. Anyone who lives here knows these areas. York Center, Eglinton Lawrence, Scarborough Rouge Park, Etobicoke Lakeshore. These are major areas. So in other words, if you look at this, Toronto also voted for a reduction in the expenses and corruption within the City Hall. So democracy has been spoken for. And the court, the judge, what we will call an activist judge, who's trying to use that as an excuse, has no standing, either in numbers, any kind of evidence to back up his claims, and he certainly doesn't have precedent within the constitutional law. He is going in contradiction to it. And yet all the lefties I know are accusing the conservatives of doing that. Because once democracy does not go their way, they want no part of democracy. They cheer anything that interferes with it. And this is the Marxist and socialist nature of the left. And the brainwashing through constant bombardment of propaganda on social media and the mainstream media that I see every single day in nonstop abundance. So in the interesting part I had here, now this is a star. There is left wing that if they went any further, they'd be a Stalinist paper. They are without shame. But I found an article talking about Mike Harris back in the 90s. Kathleen Wynne was involved, now education minister. Okay, so she eventually became the premier of Ontario for the last decade. But at the time when the megacity happened, she was, this guy Sewell, he was the main person pushing back against the amalgamation against the province. She was his right hand. And then she became premier. And guess what happened? When she was in office, they put in some legislation that said that the city of Toronto had veto power and say over their own city council, and that the province of Ontario didn't have the right to change it. Now, the only problem with this, first of all, besides the fact that it was completely partisan and biased, is that it's not constitutional. Let me give you an example of how constitutional law works in any decent functioning constitutional democracy. So the highest law trumps lower laws. Now, this is why if someone comes with a contract and says, I'll give you a free, I'll give you a free iPhone if you sign this contract and become my slave and live in chains for the next 2 years. Regardless if you sign that contract, the higher law is not the business contract. It is the Constitution, which is that you cannot be enslaved because of your personal liberty. So the contract is invalid before you ever sign it. It doesn't matter how many times you sign this contract. It'll never be valid in that country. And it's the same thing here. This law that was written up is not constitutional because it subverts our constitutional powers that are laid out for provinces and the different levels of government. And so once again, we see their attempt to try and subvert democratic rule over, and I know many Americans and people abroad, they don't know this, but in Canada, we have 2 areas of constant problems. We have Toronto, which is is the biggest city we have, and it is a constant struggle to control the corruption of the city hall there. They're not just ineffective, they have people that have been there for decades sitting on this council. And then, of course, there's British Columbia. It's got its own, I won't even get into that, but it's got its own weirdness. So really what this is a threat to the privileged class. And they're attempting to try and sound like many communists throughout history do, that they're speaking for the little people. You should see how much these people spend. I saw a listing of it. It's unbelievable. They are just floating in cash. Rob Ford here, if you don't remember him here, he got more popular as time went by. And his approval rating kept bouncing back up. Even though he had all these problems, it just kept bouncing back up because people are so desperately tired of the corruption, and they knew this guy was not in the inner circles. That's all they cared about. All right, so this is the States, but we're going to listen to Jeff Sessions. Despite the fact that I have my issues with him, he sat as an elected official. He was in the Senate, for instance, and we also have him here talking about the Justice Department as he's the Attorney General. He's going to reflect on the problem with judges. Okay, so let me be clear about this. Judges their job is to interpret law as it is. They are not, and I repeat, they are never to infuse their rulings with their own personal morality. That is not their job. They are also not supposed to take their decisions and attempt to forge a pseudo type of legislative whole for people to have what they think is a morally correct avenue within that society. In other words, if the law says all houses have to be painted red, and that is the level of government you are looking at, you're not ruling higher or lower, then you always enforce that law as it is written. If you get to the point of having constitutional law like we're talking about here, then when the Constitution says the province has the say over municipalities, period, then that is the law you enforce. That is the ruling that you find, and it is not what happened here.
As Attorney General, I have been shocked, really, by the actions of certain judges and courts that we've dealt with who are failing to respect the constitutional responsibilities of the executive and the legislative branches. These branches are co-equal. The court is not superior. The court does not get to have the final word in every dispute. Give me a break. All courts are empowered to decide specific cases and controversies, but they do not have every word. On matters of policy, the branches that are directly accountable to the people, and I've been there, I had to be accountable, must be given their proper respect. The new vehicle that we're seeing today, and I'd like to talk to you about, that's being used by activist judges to direct executive policy and functioning, is the issuing of nationwide injunctions, orders that block the entire United States government from enforcing an executive branch policy or carrying out a legislative statute. And it's just not in one district. They issue orders that apply nationwide, and not just to parties before the court, but to everybody throughout the country. So the courts have been calling them nationwide injunctions. Well, I think that's true, but it would be fitting to call them non-party injunctions or limitless injunctions, since they bind all of America and grant relief to those who are not parties to the case. And they are usually preliminary injunctions, so they block important government actions before a trial has occurred.
So the point of this that applies here is that this is a case of a judge who is blocking a proper and legal action by the provincial levels of the legislature to reform the size before an election of a municipal council. Now, just so people know, because a lot of people don't know about Toronto, they currently have, I think it's 47 seats on their council. Now, when you compare this to others, like I think 15 in Los Angeles, and that's about the norm. So you're looking at a 3-time explosion in the numbers, and each of these counselors, there's not a reduction in their pay. They're actually above the average in pay in this country. So this is a massive expense that's paid for by the rest of Ontario outside of Toronto. And so everyone has a say in this. Everyone has skin in this game. And there's nothing cruel. There's no denial of people's access One of the pathetic attempts by this judge was to say it denies freedom of expression under the charter to the voters of Toronto. Well, first of all, as I've already shown, they've shown their voice. They voted, most of them, for conservative. And then, in addition to that, we have, for the ones that are left that are upset about this, they clearly have plenty of opportunity to voice their opinion about it. But the fact of the matter is, there's going to be less people. It doesn't mean that you don't get officials. It doesn't mean that you don't get representation. It just means that it's going to be in a different form of fewer seats. But like children, they just can't stop. And Jeff Sessions here is laying out the danger that at some of these courts at different levels, these things apply to the entire country in their implication. And to people who never even brought charges, they will also be covered by the rulings. Additionally, these actions by these judges are often meant to block the legislature. So remember that one. This one here is a little clip from Douglas Murray on a TV show recently. He is in England. He's British. And so this is the BBC. I'm sorry for the video quality. What was going on there was that a court decided that prisoners would be allowed to vote. And the legislature put a stop to it. And people, a lot of people on the left are bellyaching about this. And here's his response.
Is it right that MPs tonight chose to deny prisoners the vote?
I don't agree. The man who brought this case to Strasbourg, John Hurst, was sent to prison for bludgeoning an old lady to death. The European Court of Human Rights decided his human rights had been violated by not having the right to vote. I think he violated every imaginable right of the woman who he bludgeoned to death and still isn't sorry for. I think that this case points to the terrible thing that is happening in Strasbourg, which is that activist judges and ambulance-chasing lawyers are creating a situation where the ordinary human rights of ordinary people are routinely being trumped by the unordinary rights of people who have behaved appallingly in society. And I have to say there is one other reason why I think this is an important thing, which is that when David Cameron was asked about this at Prime Minister's Questions, he said that the idea that Strasbourg could force prisoner votes on this country made him feel physically sick. There is a serious democratic problem when something which has no support in the House of Commons, very little support, I think, in the country, and something which makes the Prime Minister sick is nevertheless forced on this country. So I think there's a second reason why this is a good thing, which is that it has shown that our Parliament remains sovereign and can override and ignore decisions from Strasbourg. That is a very important precedent.
All right, so what we're seeing here is he's talking about the fact, now in this case it's the European Court, but that a court does not have the right to overrule the will of the people in the legislature. And he's absolutely correct. And this is another example. This judge is saying that this is against the will of the people in Toronto. It's a violation of their rights. But this judge has no data to back up that claim whatsoever. And that is his obligation in order to make this ruling. That onus is on him. So the fact that, much more disturbing to me than we have a judge here attempting to do this. And in Canada now we have at the federal and also the provincial level a notwithstanding clause. Why they're so angry is now Doug Ford and the Conservatives that run the province are going to overturn this judge's ruling. At least that's what it appears to be at this point. And they're extremely upset about it. But what did you people expect? I have been telling you people, you are totalitarian in nature. You're authoritarians. You scream and froth at the mouth, and then you mock anyone that you've injured that has been run roughshod. This is not the way to run a society, and it won't stand. This is the reason the notwithstanding clause was created. This is the exact reason, and it is now going to be used. And good for Doug Ford. And shame on all of you for pretending that you can speak for everyone in Toronto and that your real motivation here is about democracy and the will of the people and freedom of expression. You've shown contempt for it at every single stage. And then in Canada here, there's a rift on the Supreme Court over judicial activism. This is from going on 2 years ago. And this is just like a closing thought. The Supreme Court of Canada is crossing the line by intruding on Parliament's policymaking role. This critique is not being leveled by right-wing politicians, political scientists, eager politicians, or dissatisfied litigants, but rather by judges of the court itself. Our annual review of the court's top 10 decisions highlights 5 judges who harshly criticized their colleagues for inappropriately interfering with Parliament's job. It's a serious critique that goes to the heart of the relative responsibilities of the court versus Parliament and points to a growing philosophical rift. In R versus Lloyd, Justice Chief Beverly McLaughlin wrote majority reasons striking down a 1-year mandatory minimum penalty for repeat drug trafficking. She suggested Parliament legislate to allow judges to depart from other mandatory sentences to keep them from suffering a similar fate. However, Justices Richard Wagner, Clément Gascon, and Russell Brown dissented, stating that if the Chief Justice's approach is followed, quote, one must question what role is left for Parliament's legitimate policy choices in settling punishment, end quote. They added that these, quote, are questions of policy that are within the exclusive domain of Parliament, end quote. So what we're getting at here is that there are justices themselves in these courts and at these levels that are pointing out this activism and how bad it has gotten. Anyways, in summary, I will just say that the left is out of control. You people hate democracy. You have contempt for the average person. You want to take people's money. You want to rule over them. You think you're superior, and you're getting exactly what you deserve. And I completely support this use of notwithstanding clause, and you guys can go get fucked.
You guys think you're above the law. Well, you ain't above mine.
Can you go a little faster?